you have your Bible or you have a way to access your Bible today, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3 and in Exodus chapter 4. We're going to read parts of both of that. We're going to look at one of the greatest biblical figures today. His name is Moses. We started this series last week asking the question, what does the Bible say about how we can begin to fear less in our lives? It's true, I think we would all admit it here this morning, that we all have fears. I mean, no matter how much faith you have, we all have some fears. And, you know, when the pollsters go around and they ask Americans, like, what are you afraid of? You know, the answers are almost always the same things that everyone says. I'm afraid of this. If you ask kids, what are you afraid of? They're going to say what? Afraid of the dark. If you ask adults, what are you afraid of? You're going to get a cadre of different kinds of answers. You're going to get people who say, I'm afraid of closed spaces. It's claustrophobia. Some people are afraid of, I heard the sissing over there, the snakes, right? And spiders and something about that just kind of fears, maybe even eerie, feeling about that. We're afraid of a lot of different things. But one of the things that we're mostly afraid of is we're afraid of death. It's one of the things that always is at nearly the top of the list. But do you know the number one fear consistently in America? People say, I'm afraid of this. The number one fear is the fear of public speaking. I get to do that every single week. How wonderful that is to have the opportunity to face that fear. People often ask me, they'll say, do you ever get nervous about getting up in front of people and publicly speaking? And my answer is, yes, always. But there are different kinds of fears that we feel and we experience. The first time I ever had to publicly speak, I can still remember it very well. I was in 8th grade. I was in Coach Minter's class. This was junior high. And in Coach Minter's class, we were all given an assignment. We had to answer a question and then get up in front of the class and then speak about it to the whole class. I can remember being given the assignment and being so nervous that I didn't write anything down. And so when I got up there to publicly speak, I didn't have much of anything to say. I don't know what I said. I don't remember what I said. I kind of blacked out. All I remember was through the whole experience, I kept looking over at the door. And I kept thinking to myself, I have enough time to get out of here. I could take a run for it. There's something about getting up in front of people that is so intimidating and it's so frightening, and it's in all of us that there's some anxiety about that. Last year, Tiger Woods kind of came out of retirement or whatever that was, and he started playing golf again publicly, and the microphone went into his mouth, and somebody said, "Are you nervous?" And Tiger Woods said, "Yeah, I'm nervous." And then he made this comment. He said, "Of course I'm nervous. I care about what I do." And he made that comment. I kind of thought, sometimes in life we're nervous, we're scared because we're just scared of doing something we're uncomfortable doing. But sometimes we're afraid or we're scared because there's high stakes, because we care about what we're doing. The man we're going to meet here in Exodus chapter 3 comes to this pivotal moment in his life. He has to confront one of his greatest fears. If he doesn't confront it, if he doesn't deal with it, the whole Bible is going to be written differently. The man's name is Moses, and his encounter is at a burning bush. As he makes his way to the burning bush here in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is living in Midian. He is living out among the sheep. He's married. He's living life kind of easy. He's wandering some sheep along through the desert, and he comes to the mountain called in the Bible Horeb, sometimes called Sinai. And when he's there, he sees a bush on fire in the distance, and it doesn't stop burning. He draws closer to the bush, and he hears a voice. The voice says things like this: "Take your shoes off. The place you're standing is holy ground." The voice from the bush knows his name. And then it says this, Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt." If you don't know, at this moment in Moses' life, Israel has been slaves in Egypt for more than 400 years. I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. You can almost hear the whips of those Egyptian slave drivers on the backs of those Israelites. I am concerned about their suffering, and so I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians, to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with, what's those words? Milk and honey. Now, milk and honey may not sound all that great to you, but can you imagine being a slave in Egypt in the dry, dusty desert, and your mouth is dry all the time, and you would just long for some milk? Can you imagine eating nothing but old crummy bread and just wishing that you could have some honey, something sweet? A land that flows with milk and honey. It's the home of the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the termites. So no, that's Texas. Texas is that's where the termites are. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, here's God saying, okay, now this is your part of the story, Moses. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Okay, this is a real simple job. This is what I want you to do. Go down to Egypt, get my people out. Plain and simple. But, see that in verse 11? We start to see the objections. The call of God is clear. This is what I want you to do. And then we start to see Moses' response. But, Moses said to God, who am I? You ever said that to God? Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. This will be the sign to you that it is I who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And we know that later on in the Bible because that's where the Ten Commandments come from. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites. And so he's still coming up with his reasons why he doesn't want to do what God's asking him to do. I know that Moses is the only one who's ever done that. Suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what's his name? Like, who is this you're talking about? What shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's the sacred name of God, Yahweh. Means I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am, or Yahweh has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. I want to skip to more of Moses' response in chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 4, verse 1, Moses would then answer God again. What if? He is the king of excuses. What if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? And the Lord said to him, what's that in your hand? Now, he's a shepherd, so what's in his hand? A staff. Can you just picture Moses, long beard, rough clothes, shepherd out there in the wilderness, just kind of enjoying life, living out in the land? What's that in your hand? A staff, he said. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Can you just picture that? He just throws it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake. Anybody afraid of snakes? Moses was too. Look what it says. And he ran from it. And the Lord said to him, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and he took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. That's a pretty neat trick, huh? This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. God's not done yet. Look what he says next. Then the Lord said, put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, his skin was leprous. That means it was white. It had become as white as snow. Now put it back into your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak. When he took it out, it was restored. It was like the rest of his flesh. And the Lord said, if they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, God's not through yet. Take some water from the Nile, that's the great big river that runs through Egypt, and pour it on the dry ground, and the water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. Okay, so God's telling them all that. Look at verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord." Excuse me, God. "I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go." You hear God? "Go. I'll help you speak. I'll teach you what to say." But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." Look what God did, verse 14. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, "Well, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He's already on his way to meet you. He'll be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I'll help both of you speak and will teach you what to say. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it." Moses has come to a moment in his life in which God has spoken directly to him. "This is what I want you to do," period. And Moses' response to God is he wants to run out the door. So our message this morning is simple. Stop running from God. I want us just to take just a moment and look at this story and ask some really obvious questions, because I think they're going to apply to our lives. And the first question is just to kind of get in our own mind, like, what made his job so hard, right? What made this job so hard for Moses that as he's standing before God, he doesn't want to do it? And that's something for us to think about too, right? Like, God has something for us to do. What makes it so hard for us to do it? And maybe you can relate to Moses this morning, because maybe some of the same things you've said to God, Moses is saying to God here. One of them is this. Part of what made it hard for him to do this was what he had done in the past, right? I know people, or I've heard people, and maybe you're one of these people who say, "I can't do this for God because of my past," right? "Now, I can't do that for God because I did this back then, or because of this part of my history, or because of my past. I can't do that for God." You say, well, what was Moses' past? What was so bad that he had done? Well, I'll read it to you. It's in Exodus chapter 2. It's in the previous chapter. Moses had grown up in Egypt, you know. He'd lived in the house of Pharaoh. But he always knew he was an Israelite. And one day, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, it's on your outline. We can put it on the screen here. It says, one day, this is back when he's living in Egypt. One day, Moses, grown up, he went out to where his people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. You know, I picture him with the nice Egyptian golden cup in his hand and nice Egyptian clothes, and he's looking at his people in hard labor, slaving away. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Look at this moment right here. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one. Can you see that? Moses looks this way, this way, that. He's looking around to see who's watching. Seeing no one, what did he do? He killed the Egyptian. How many of you today knew that Moses was a murderer? He killed the Egyptian. Not only that, it says he hid him in the sand. You see maybe why he might not want to go back to Egypt? In fact, the text goes on, and we didn't put it on the screen, but in the next verse, 2 verses, it says that he was afraid because people had found out what he had done. He was afraid, and so he fled. Exodus chapter 2, verse 14. He fled Egypt. He went hundreds of miles to Midian. He got out of there, and then the verse tells us in verse 14 and 15 that Pharaoh wanted to kill him. He had a path. He doesn't want to go back there. He doesn't want to go back to Egypt. Those people know what he did. Sometimes we do that in life, don't we? God, I can't go there. Those people know about my past. That's what made the job hard. Here's another thing that made the job hard. What he had to say, right? God didn't say, now go down to Egypt and bring them some good news, you know? Go down there and tell them, hey, everything's going to be good. You're going to have 7 years of plenty. No, he said, go down there and tell the most powerful man on the planet that you want to take his most valuable assets, the Israelites that are building your cities, and you want to take them away for 3 days into the wilderness where they're going to worship God. I mean, this is not an easy thing to say. But then I think maybe what made it so hard, really what made it so hard, is who he had to say it to, right? God didn't send him to just anybody. He sent him to Pharaoh, the son of the man who wanted to kill him because of what he had done in the past. He wanted to send him into the presence of Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man literally on the planet, the one who ruled an international superpower. Egypt ran the world. Can you see Moses thinking to himself, I'm going to walk in here with this great big beard. I got these old raggedy clothes. I smell like sheep. And I'm going to come strolling into the courts of Pharaoh, and I'm going to say, hey, why don't you? No way. That's the hardest job you could possibly think of. Now, how did Moses react to it? And let's see if we can see some parallels in our own life about maybe God speaking to us and how we respond to God. What we find here is one of the most classic examples of excuses anywhere in the Bible. They're all fearful excuses. Somebody told me that an excuse is the skin of the truth stuffed with a lie. It's like an excuse is, I'm going to tell you something that sounds good on the outside, but on the inside I know that it's really not true. There's a little bit of, that's not really the truth in it. Notice some of Moses' excuses here and see if we can draw some parallels to our own life. The first one is in chapter 3, verse 11, when God appears to him in the bush and says, I want you to go and do this. Moses' first response to God is, who am I? In other words, his excuse was about himself, right? His first excuse to God when God gave him an assignment was about him. Like, who am I, God, to go and to do this? You know, all through the Bible, we're shown in the life of Moses, the life of Abraham, the life of Paul, right through, that God often will call someone who's not equipped for the task. There's an old saying that says, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. And so right in this moment, Moses probably doesn't feel like he's the right guy for the job, but I think maybe God knows if he is. And so his excuse is, Lord, sort of like, who am I? And sometimes maybe we say that to God, like, who am I to be used by you, God? But then his second excuse is, who are you? Again, it's about God. His excuse here is really an excuse about God. You want me to go and tell them that you have this message. Like, who are you again? What am I supposed to say? The God of my fathers sent me? This is a problem you have to understand in that world, because this was a world in which everybody had their gods. And Egypt had their gods. The Egyptians worshipped the sun. They called him Re. And they believed that Pharaoh was the son of Re. They believed that Pharaoh was the son of God. And so this was a battle of the gods. Like who are you again, God? Like, is this God able to take on the God of Egypt? Now, we may ask that question today because our culture has gods. We don't build great big temples to gods in the same way that ancient cultures did, but we still have gods. Our society worships a God with a capital P called pleasure. Our society loves and worships at the altar of pleasure. We idolize power and position. We worship in our society a God of sex, lust, and money. Our society and the people in it will do anything possible to attain and achieve these things, and they worship and grovel at the feet of them. And for people who don't believe in God, we often hear people say this, well, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. You ever heard somebody say that? It's always a funny thing for me to say. I actually really love science, but I also know that science is not a religion per se. Science is an endeavor. Scientia is the old Latin that means to know something. Science is the practice of observing and learning, and it's not something you put your faith in. I mean, after all, when I was a kid, we were taught in school that there were 9 planets in the solar system. They don't teach that anymore. There are 8. Now, tomorrow, scientists may say, ladies and gentlemen, we've just discovered a new planet, or 10 more, Or who knows? Science, here's the thing about science. Science changes, doesn't it? Discoveries, things that we used to think, we now no longer think. But the God of the Bible is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's a God I want to put my faith in, is the one who never changes. There's like some new discovery like, oh, wow, look, God is really like this. No, he's the same. So Moses responds with a who am I? He responds with a who are you? But then he responds, number 3, in chapter 4, verse 1, with a this. What if they don't believe? And of all the questions Moses asks, this is one I can relate to the most. It is about the response. It is about the response. It is a fearful excuse. God, I don't want to do that because it's going to be a pointless endeavor. If I go down to Egypt and do all this, they're not going to respond favorably to what it is I have to say. But here's God's message all through the Bible. So what? In the days of Isaiah, he said, don't send me to those people. They have eyes, but they won't see. They have ears, but they won't hear. They got hearts, but they're hardened. God says, go anyway. The days of Jeremiah, he said, go anyway. Speak anyway. All through the Bible, God calls his people to faithfulness in the communication of his word, regardless of the response, right? But here's another excuse. Chapter 4, verse 10, he says, I am slow of speech. He said, I'm not an eloquent man, I'm a shepherd, God. Like, what do you want? You want me to go into the courts of Pharaoh? I'm not a really good speaker. I'm kind of slow of speech. This is about his ability. And a lot of times we might say to God, God, I can't do this for you because I don't have the ability to do that. Sometimes God can use your disability to achieve his abilities. We had a man in our church when we were living in Austin. He'd come on our staff and he had a speech impediment. He literally had a stutter. And he said, I can do all these things in the church. He says, but I just can't speak. I said, well, you're going to be preaching the next sermon. Because I want you, and he really could speak. And he got out there and he preached an incredible message. And God spoke through him to people I could never speak to. God spoke through his disability in ways that I could never speak in any of my abilities. You may be saying to yourself, well, I have a disability. I can't do this or I can't do that. But sometimes God uses those things to achieve something else in and through your life. Here's a final one. There are all these excuses, and then you get to the last one in chapter 4, verse 13, and he says, please send someone else. This is an excuse about willingness. Now, this is a more serious kind of thing, because all of these other things, we can deal with these things, but this one is just is an issue of the heart. Like, God can work through all of your disabilities, and God can work through all of your challenges, but this morning, God cannot work through your unwillingness. You have to be willing for God to use you in order to do that. But God doesn't stop right there, and God doesn't leave you stuck. Notice what he does for Moses, and this is how I want to quickly finish this sermon. What did God do to help? Maybe God will do this in your life. What did God actually do to help Moses kind of get through this moment and get on? Well, he did a couple things. One, he challenged him to face his fears. I mean, like, one by one, God challenges him to face his fears. God met every one of his excuses with a rebuttal. Moses would say, well, God, I can't do this. And God, who are you? And all that. Every time Moses had an excuse, God had an answer. Who am I? God said, I'm going to show you what to do. I'm going to be your God. I'm going to help you do it. He said, well, what about you? Well, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm your maker. Well, what if they don't believe? I'll give you 3 signs, he says. You can take your staff and turn it into a snake. You can turn your hand white. I mean, you can pour water on the ground, turn it into blood. God's got an answer for every excuse. One by one, he goes through this list until finally you get to the willingness in chapter 4, verse 13. God doesn't have a response to that. In fact, if you read in your Bible what it says God responded, it says, and the Lord burned with anger. God doesn't have a response today to our unwillingness, except for that he's frustrated. God doesn't have a response today to our unwillingness, except for he said, look at all the things I've done for you. Look at all the ways that I've helped you. Look at all of that. In this moment, what he does is he challenges Moses to face his fears. But he does something else, and maybe he'll do this for you this morning. He taught him to look to his past, not mistakes, but success. What we do is we see our mistakes. Folks, I can tell you right now, all the mistakes of my life, they go through my mind. Every time I'm about to get ready to preach, I'm thinking, well, Lord, I didn't do this right, I didn't do this right, I didn't do that right. And I have to say, okay, God, I have to remember the successes. I have to remember who you are. And if I can't remember any other success, I just got to remember Calvary. I got to remember the cross. John Singer Sargent, I tell his story all the time. He's the international famous portrait painter from the 1800s, early 1900s. He did the portraits of presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and so on. But he was this great painter, but he had this incredible feeling of self-criticism that he couldn't do anything right. And so somebody would ask him to do a painting, and he would say, oh, I can't do that. So to help him with this, he said that he kept one of his first great paintings, quite valuable. And that in order to encourage himself, he would look at the painting that he had successfully painted, and he would say to himself these words, I painted that. And that reminder of his past success inspired him to believe that he could do future things good. God may have to remind you and me from time to time of past successes in order for us to see. God would say, well, who are you again? Moses said, who are you again, God? He said, I'm the God of Abraham. Remember what I did in the life of Abraham? Remember how I led him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, how I brought him to the promised land? Remember Isaac? Remember how I was faithfully took care of him? Remember Jacob? Remember how I took care of him when he was in the wilderness, when he wrestled with an angel? Remember how I walked with him? You remember how I led and guided Jacob? Remember how I took care of the Israelites and provided for them in Egypt? Remember all the past success. Inspire you to have confidence in the future. But here's the main thing God did. Over and over and over again in this chapter. He assured Moses of his own presence. He assured him of divine presence. Again and again and again in this chapter, he said, look, Moses, you're not walking into Pharaoh's court by yourself. You're not going through life by yourself. Who are you? His name is Yahweh. It means I am. I was, I am, I will be. I am the God who is with you. When Jesus finished the Great Commission, Matthew 28, he told him to do all this stuff. And then he said this, and lo, I am with you always. I've got something for you to do. I've got a job for you to do. God has something for you to do. But you don't have to be afraid that you're going to go into it by yourself. He's going to go with you. Wherever you go, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the psalmist said, the Lord is with me. I was reading this morning, and I got up kind of early. I was just reading through all of Exodus. I was like, I just really want to make sure I know the whole story really, really well. I'm not often reading Exodus. And I was reading through chapter 1, and I was just reading the story of Moses at the very beginning of his life. And kind of like how, you may remember the story about how Pharaoh had given the order to all the midwives in Egypt who took care of the babies when they were born, that every boy that was born was to be killed. And the midwives of Egypt said, the Israelite midwives in Egypt said, we're not going to do that. And so they would one by one try to save these boys. And one of the boys that was saved was a little boy that was put into the reeds of the Nile. And he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. He was nursed by an Israelite, but he was raised in the house of the Egyptian king. And she even gave him his name. Do you know that? Moshe means drawn out of the Nile. The princess of Egypt gave Moses his name. But I was reading in chapter 1, verse 17, where it talked about that moment when Pharaoh gave the order to the midwives. He said, I order you to kill them when they're born. The Bible says in Exodus chapter 1, verse 17, that the midwives feared the Lord more than the Pharaoh of Egypt. That they feared God more than they feared the order coming down from Egypt. It's an incredible moment of courage. For you and I to stop running from God, We're going to have to do what the midwives did in Egypt. We're going to have to be willing to fear Him and honor Him and obey Him more than we fear everything else in our life.